Hello, my name is David Cass. I am president of CISOs Connect, and I'm also a practicing CISO. This is a CISOs Connect podcast. I'm joined today by Marco Maiurano. So, Marco, could you, introduce yourself, give us a little bit about your background, and we'll kind of have a discussion from there.
Yeah, great. And David, thank you for inviting me to speak on the podcast. So, Marco Maiurano, I'm the Chief Information Security Officer at First Citizens Bank. I've been at First Citizens for about 3 years now.
So, as a CISO in financial services, we're highly regulated industry. Things are always changing. So, how do you prioritize and keep pace with all of the threats, as well as kind of figure out what regulations are coming my way?
Yeah, I mean, there are a myriad of things that we have to constantly think about from a regulatory environment, from a threat perspective. But really, at the end of the day, it's really about protecting the bank, ensuring the trust of our clients, and ensuring the trust of our internal clients, right? So it's really around how do I take that very customer-centric view to say, how do I secure this bank? How do I fit into the larger financial services sector? So when I think about kind of some of the things that we are dealing with within financial services, the regulatory pressure is just increasing, and we're seeing that, and in a good way, right? The regulators are holding us accountable to ensure that we have the appropriate controls in place and things like that. What I have seen is, the regulators take a very clear stance on, we're not telling you how to build something. We just want to really make sure that you understand the risk and how are you addressing that risk. So we take a very risk-based approach around what is the intel telling us? What are we seeing in the sector? What are we seeing overseas? What are we seeing at other financial institutions? And as I mentioned, in other organizations or other industries as well. And then how well are our controls working, and how are we addressing and how are we pivoting to really address the threats that we're seeing. And then, at the end of the day, financial services, we are banks, right? So how do I ensure that I am getting the appropriate funding for the programs and the project, and really ensuring that I'm increasing the people, processes, and technology and things like that, continuing to mature that, so we can respond to an ever-evolving landscape. So I know I kind of went broad and wide there, but hope that...
Now, there's some really great points, and kind of as we dive into each of those sections, as you mentioned, it has to be risk focus and customer focus. So how do you think about the litany of controls that are available to us? When we talk about like NIST 853, Rev 5 or 6 or things like that, where there's literally hundreds of controls that are available. So how do you bring in the right controls and balance that so you're again protecting everything that needs to be protected, but also making it a good experience?
So yeah, and I think we do have to think about the internal client experience and the external client experience, right? But we also have to make sure that we're protecting and keeping people safe. And sometimes, there are instances as a CISO where you have to make a decision that might, on the surface, feel like it's just another step. Or, oh my God, now I have to do MFA. I got to look at my cell phone to put in the code. But really making sure that you're bringing your customers internally, externally along for the journey, right? So you mentioned a couple of different frameworks. Frameworks are great because they help us frame our work, but they're not the answer to everything, right? And one of the things I chat with the board often about is, well, did you follow NIST or FFIEC CATS specifically, or whatever? And I said, I don't know one hacker that studies FFIEC and NIST and says, well, I'm just only going to attack it this way. So what we really think about, I grew up in a security organization that was really around practice how you fight, right? So you could put in the controls, you could measure the control effectiveness, you could do all the risk reporting you can do to make sure that your board risk committee knows how you're looking to prioritize and reduce the risk, but really kind of leveraging things like pen testing to really check and see, hey, these are how we're seeing things happening out in the environment. This is how threat actors are working, looking to see on the dark web how what folks are bragging about and all that other stuff. And then how do I get my threat hunt team? How do I make sure that I simulate a very kind of threat adversarial mindset and attack myself in a safe way, right? So and then understanding based on the customer journey, how folks are interacting with the environment, both internally, externally, how they're coming into the organization in the appropriate ways. How do I make sure that I'm testing as many scenarios as I can and putting in the controls to make sure that we're reducing that risk? The risk is never going to be zero. We're also not going to bubble wrap laptops because that just doesn't make sense, right? And there's nothing quicker than than putting in so much security that you actually halt operations and then you stop making money, right?
Yeah,
So yeah.
yeah, and that's a great point. And as you kind of, pulling on a thread a little bit when you start thinking about it, as you mentioned, most of the regulators are, guidance based rather than prescriptive as far as what they're expecting. So it's more of, how do you address the principles of the regulation to make sure that you're doing what needs to be done. And you also kind of hit on that, the threat landscape is continuously evolving, especially in financial services, because it's a highly targeted industry. So how often, would you recommend that CISOs kind of rethink their program? Some people develop their program and they think this is going to be the program for the next 3 years. So how often would you suggest that CISOs kind of need to revisit their, is my program right?
Yeah, I mean, and I, we were joking around. I probably shouldn't say this, right? We wait every holiday for something to happen, right? The big hack comes in and all of that, and that's usually when people start rethinking, and that's probably not the right time to do it. So, when I first, embarked at First Citizens Bank, had a 3-year strategy, right? And a lot of it was really because we were building a lot of core capabilities or foundational capabilities and building those out. And I found that I had to actually pull that in a little bit. Really think maybe at most 18 months out or 2 years out. But what I do employ is the idea of continuous control monitoring. It's not a new idea, but how do I make sure that based on the threat scenarios that I'm seeing externally, how do I make sure that I'm testing myself to see if the strategy still works? And that's why I know I say this sometimes and I joke around. That's why I always have draft on my strategy because something can change out of nowhere, right? I think about CrowdStrike, well, although not a cyber incident, really brought to the forefront cyber resilience and how are we thinking about our core systems or core processes, core vendor or critical vendors, excuse me. Um, so that is going to change how I start thinking about some of my other vendors. Where do I have some additional concentration risk and things like that? Tool rationalization, make sure all my tools are working. I do have built-in resilience for EDR and all those other things. So I think CISOs should constantly be keeping their ears to the ground, talking with other CISOs to understand what's happening in the world around them. And yeah, I mean, look, it's hard because you got to get the budget every year. So it can't be like every 6 months you change your strategy, but there should be enough resilience and flexibility built in where you can pivot where you need to pivot, whether it's deploy a new tool, whether it's deploy people or bolster up processes in another area. But I do think as part of at least for me, part of my annual process, I get with the team and we go through and say what's working, what's not working, where do we need to improve. So I look at it once a year. But as I said, you got to constantly keep your ear to the ground because things change in a minute.
Yeah, and you had a great point about the kind of continuous control monitoring. I think that's an area that CISOs kind of struggle to implement. So what kind of suggestions would you have for, I guess, CISOs that are looking to kind of embark on that journey?
Yeah, so I've actually been gifted a great challenge where a lot of what we were doing was very manual. And through a couple of acquisitions, I've had the ability to kind of leapfrog some of the technology that currently exists, but also introduce a lot of automation. So some of the things I do, right, you got to get your control library in place. You got to do all the testing. You got to make sure that you have everything you're doing. But one of the things we are leveraging tools, and I don't want to say any specific tool in general, but allows us to just measure and monitor how well that control is tested against kind of new attack patterns, threats. Am I patching, or is IT patching what they need to patch and all of that? And it allows me to see where I might not be, the control environment might not be as resilient as I thought it was, because hey, I put all these tools in and it works. But then you get a new piece of malware come in or something, or a new scenario, and you're like, wow, that got a lot further into the stack than I thought it would, or through my layers. Maybe I need to bolster there. So that's another area. Once again, it's how do I make sure that I also get the investment for those areas? So what I also found with the continuous control monitoring is I can really do some really great reporting around, am I solving a $10 million problem with a $500,000 solution, or am I solving a $500,000 problem with a $10 million solution? So it really allows me to make sure that, one, I'm getting the funding that I need to fix those controls. But two, the continuous control monitoring allows me to really kind of get a pulse check, almost like a health dashboard of where we're at. And then there's a kind of longer term benefits too, because every year I have to go to the board and say, this is how we did in the GLBA, this is how we did in the FFIC, this is how we did in NIST. So this allows me to kind of keep an eye on whether I'm actually maturing the organization from a risk perspective, or if I'm staying stagnant, or if I'm falling behind and not really, optimizing the controls that I need to optimize.
No, that's great. And then, as your organization has kind of grown and changed, there's a lot of CISOs that I guess are, either coming newly into the role, and now it's, I guess, a heightened environment of, heightened accountability, heightened regulations. What kind of recommendations, you've been fortunate that you've been building, organizations. So what kind of recommendations would you have for new CISOs coming in? Like when you land in an organization, where do you start?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so I have gotten this question in the past. Start with the business. Understand how does the organization operate? How do they make money? What is their strategy? Where are they looking to go? What have they thought about as far as their own roadmaps around products and offering, depending on the industry that you're in. So really getting close with the business, right? So that's one side of it. The other side is, of course, you're going to have to get all your reporting, make sure that you understand how we're measuring the environment and all of that. But I really think also partnering with your CIO or CTO or the business unit CTOs to really understand where the organization is looking to go, but also understand your environment as well. I'm a big proponent, and if you have the budget, is really kind of whenever you show up in a new place, I always do. I don't call it a breach detection, right? But I'll bring in an external party, some of the bigger names that'll come in and just make sure that the environment is clean. And that's just a sanity check. And also for me, I use that as leverage but I use that as leverage when I talk with regulars. Hey, I've come in. Regulars always question, why is there a new CISO coming in? What's going on? Hey, I've done a breach detect. I wanted to see if anything, compromise assessment. Excuse me, I was calling it a breach. A compromise assessment. I've been able to verify here, but I also find some areas that I can fix. Those are quick wins for a new CISO coming on board. But really, like I said, it's really getting to, building that stakeholder followership, making sure that the business understands where you're coming from, what you're trying to do, see you as a partner from the beginning. I've seen CISOs come in, even CISOs I've worked for, where they're very concentrated on the technology. They're very concentrated on, I got to build my IAM program. Yes, those are all important things, but they fail to build the camaraderie and the friendships and the collegial, relationships with their stakeholders. Because at the end of the day, we're here to make sure that the business can operate and do it in a safe and secure manner. So they're really important.
Yeah, those are great points. And I especially like the point about kind of building the baseline as you come in, because I think it used to be always, what was it, like about that book, The First 90 Days? I find that more often than not, you don't really have the first 90 days to get things accomplished and kind of establish yourself in an organization anymore, especially as a CISO, because people are expecting, results right away. So as we kind of wrap up, any other, I guess, parting thoughts that you'd like to share with the CISO community?
Yeah, I think coming up in security and also coming outside of security, the role of the CISO is just so different than it was even 5 years ago. I think what I've noticed when I talked with a lot of my peers, they're getting pulled into a lot more business meetings. They're getting pulled into a lot more board meetings, right? So making sure that, I'm going to say something controversial, and I always say it. The board doesn't care about your EDR, and they don't care about your IAM program. What they do care about is how are you able to work with the business? How are you able to work with technology to reduce the risk to the firm, right? To allow them to take risk, right? So making sure that you're that storyteller and not killing them with the technical jargon, but really giving them a view of how you are thinking about risk, looking at risk, keeping the organization resilient, and then how do you give them the opportunity to actually govern, right? A lot of folks think that the board, in many cases, are there to make decisions. They're not. They're there to, noses in, fingers out. But how do you make sure that you empower them with the data that they need, understanding of the risk that's present in the environment, or the inherent risk, your residual risk after all of your controls are in place and all of that and what's remaining, so that, your board will become your biggest advocate. So make sure that you are a storyteller, Yes, you have to have all the technical acumen. Absolutely, no one's saying no. But when you're when you're talking with the board and even some of your senior leadership outside of technology, making sure that they understand risk and what you're trying to do and things like that.
So Marco, thank you. That was great insights, and thank you so much for participating.
Appreciate it. Thank you.